The first knock on my door that night didn't sound angry. It sounded official, heavy, deliberate, the kind of knock that makes a room go quiet without anyone saying a word. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, music faded into the background, and every pair of eyes slowly turned toward the front door. For a moment, I honestly thought maybe someone had parked wrong or a neighbor needed something. When I opened the door, 2 police officers were standing there, and behind them, arms crossed and face glowing with righteous anger, stood Karen. Before I could even ask what was going on, she pointed directly at me as she had just caught a criminal in the act. "You need to arrest him," she said loudly. "He's hosting an illegal gathering and refused to invite the HOA president." The officers glanced at each other. One of them raised an eyebrow. Inside my house, a dozen confused birthday guests stood holding paper plates and half-eaten cake. Outside, Karen looked absolutely convinced she had just uncovered the crime of the century. And that was the moment I realized my quiet birthday party had somehow turned into a police matter. If you've never lived in a neighborhood with a homeowners association, it's hard to explain just how much power one person can pretend to have. When I first moved in, the streets looked peaceful, enough quiet lawns, identical mailboxes, the usual suburban calm. But it didn't take long before one name started coming up in every conversation, usually spoken a little quieter than normal. Karen. Karen was the HOA president, and she treated that title less like a volunteer role and more like a badge of authority. Every morning, she walked the neighborhood with a clipboard tucked under her arm, scanning houses the way a security guard scans for intruders. A trash can left out too long could earn you a warning. Grass slightly uneven might bring a fine. Curtains the wrong color somehow became a community aesthetic violation. People learned quickly that arguing with her only made things worse. She seemed to thrive on the attention, the confrontation, the feeling that she alone was keeping the neighborhood in line. Most neighbors kept their heads down, paid whatever ridiculous fines appeared in their mailbox, and hoped she'd move on to someone else. I decided early on that I wouldn't give her the reaction she wanted. For months, I stayed quiet, followed the rules, and avoided unnecessary conversations. From the outside, it probably looked like I was just another neighbor trying to stay out of trouble. But the truth was simpler. I was learning exactly who Karen was and how far she'd eventually push things. After months of watching Karen patrol the neighborhood like a self-appointed sheriff, I eventually reached a point where I just stopped thinking about her. Life moved on. Work got busy, routines settled in, and before I realized it, my birthday was coming up. Normally, I wouldn't make a big deal about it, but that year, I figured a small gathering might be nice. Nothing loud or chaotic. Just a few close friends, maybe a couple of neighbors who had always been friendly, some music playing softly in the background, and a table full of snacks. I planned it carefully, partly because I knew how easily Karen turned ordinary situations into official violations. Parking stayed organized along the curb. The guest list was small and the music was low enough that you could barely hear it from the street. Everything about the evening was designed to be simple and respectful. As a courtesy, I even sent a quick message to the HOA board mentioning the gathering. I didn't need permission, but I figured transparency would prevent unnecessary drama. Karen responded almost immediately. According to her, hosting a party required several community protection fees, plus special approval paperwork that conveniently didn't seem to exist anywhere in the official rules. She also informed me that as HOA president, she would need to attend to monitor compliance. Reading that message made something very clear. This wasn't about rules. Karen just wanted control. So instead of arguing, I simply made one quiet decision. Karen wasn't invited. The evening of my birthday arrived quietly, almost suspiciously calm. One by one, friends started showing up with small gifts, containers of food, and the kind of relaxed smiles that make a house feel full without needing loud music or decorations. A couple of neighbors I barely knew knocked on the door, holding bags of chips and soda, laughing nervously as if they were slightly surprised the gathering was actually allowed to happen. For the first time since moving into that neighborhood, everything felt normal. We kept things simple. Music played softly in the background while people talked in small groups around the living room. Someone started telling a ridiculous work story that had half the room laughing. Another guest was carefully balancing candles on a cake that looked slightly lopsided but perfect anyway. It was the kind of easy, ordinary moment people rarely appreciate until something interrupts it. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I kept expecting that interruption. Karen had been too quiet. A few times I noticed movement outside the front window. Nothing obvious, just shadows passing by or a car slowing slightly before continuing down the street. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was imagining things after months of dealing with her constant surveillance. Then it happened. A sudden, violent pounding exploded against the front door, loud enough to shake the frame. The room went silent. Everyone looked at me. Before I even reached the handle, a voice from the other side was already shouting, "Karen." I opened the door just enough to see her face, already flushed with anger and satisfaction, like she'd been waiting all evening for this moment. Karen stood there gripping her clipboard so tightly it looked like she might snap it in half. Before I could say a word, she launched straight into accusations, her voice loud enough for everyone inside to hear. "This gathering is illegal," she announced, pointing past me toward the living room. "You're violating HOA rules, noise ordinances, and community guidelines." I glanced back at the room behind me. People were standing quietly, some still holding drinks, the music barely audible from the speaker in the corner. If anything, the house looked calmer now than it had 10 minutes earlier. I tried explaining that it was a small birthday party and that everything was under control, but Karen clearly wasn't interested in explanations. She cut me off mid-sentence, waving her phone in the air as she had already solved the case. "I've already called the police," she said. And sure enough, a few minutes later, the flashing lights of a patrol car appeared at the end of the street. When the officers stepped onto the porch, Karen immediately took charge of the conversation, speaking quickly and dramatically about illegal gatherings, violations, and my supposed refusal to follow community authority. The officers listened politely at first, nodding occasionally, but their expressions slowly shifted from concern to quiet confusion. Inside the house, guests stood awkwardly while one officer asked me a few simple questions about the party. Everything was calm, quiet, and clearly under control. Karen didn't like that. The calmer the officers remained, the louder she became. For a moment, it looked like the situation might simply end with an awkward conversation and the officers leaving. One of them stepped back onto the porch, scanning the quiet street as if confirming there was no real disturbance. Inside the house, people were beginning to relax again. But Karen wasn't finished. Something in her expression changed, the tight smile collapsing into something sharper and more desperate. She pointed toward the decorations along the porch railing like they were pieces of evidence in a crime scene. "This is exactly what I was talking about," she snapped. Before anyone could react, she stormed past the officers and kicked one of the large planters sitting beside the steps. It tipped over instantly, soil spilling across the porch boards. A few guests gasped from the doorway while someone behind me muttered, "Is she serious right now?" Karen didn't stop there. She knocked over a string of decorations taped along the railing, tearing them down and tossing them aside like they were proof of some massive violation. Each movement grew louder and more chaotic, her voice rising as she insisted the property damage somehow proved I had forced her to take action. The officers moved quickly then. One stepped forward and firmly told her to step away from the porch, while the other calmly reminded her that everything happening was being recorded. That's when the reality finally seemed to hit her. Within seconds, the situation flipped. What Karen thought was proof of authority had turned into clear evidence of vandalism and a false police report. The officers exchanged a glance before guiding her away from the porch, down the street. Curious neighbors had already begun gathering. Several phones raised as the flashing lights painted the sidewalk red and blue. Karen's voice echoed through the night as they placed her in handcuffs, still shouting that the entire neighborhood would regret this. The aftermath unfolded more quietly than the chaos of that night, but in many ways it was far more satisfying. Over the next few weeks, statements were taken, reports were filed, and the footage from the officers' body cameras filled in every detail Karen had tried to twist. What she claimed was a dangerous situation turned out to be exactly what it looked like from the beginning. A quiet birthday party interrupted by someone who simply couldn't accept not being in control. When the case finally reached court, the evidence spoke for itself. The police reports, the recordings, and the witness statements all painted the same clear picture. Karen had called the police under pretenses, trespassed onto private property, and damaged it while officers were standing a few feet away. There wasn't much left to argue. The judge didn't spend long discussing it. Restitution was ordered for the damage she caused, along with penalties for filing a false report and interfering with a police investigation. Just as quickly as she had claimed authority over the neighborhood, her position as HOA president disappeared, and almost overnight, the atmosphere around the block changed. The endless fines stopped appearing in mailboxes. People waved again when they passed each other on the sidewalk. Conversations returned to normal things instead of whispered complaints. As for that birthday, it somehow became neighborhood legend. Not because of the cake or the party itself, but because it was the night everyone finally saw Karen's power trip collapse under its own weight.